Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Sammers. I'm a reader in art and cultural history here at Courtauld, and I'm the co-lead on the new MA in art and business. And I'm really pleased to be involved in this event, which is organised to tie in with the Oskar Reinhart exhibition. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I think this weekend is the closing weekend, so make haste. Our speaker tonight is Samuel Raybone, who is lecturer at the University of Aberystwyth. And I've written here, and so I must think it's true, one of the most imaginative new scholars of 19th century French art. So I first met Samuel a few years ago through a shared interest in collecting practices. At the time, Samuel was working on his thesis here at the Courtauld, which became his first book, Gustave Courtauld as Worker, Collector, Painter, published by Bloomsbury in 2020. In this highly original study, Samuel demonstrated how Courtauld's passion for stamp collecting, or philately, and garden design holds clues to his most intimate preoccupations and his artistic creativity. Samuel actually was invited to contribute an essay to the catalogue of the recent Courtauld exhibition, Courtauld Painter of Men, that was at the Musée d'Orsay and then went to the Chicago Art Institute. So building on his analysis of Courtauld, Samuel has explored different conceptions of artistic labour in the 19th century. He's looked at the inspiration that painters found in colourful printed ephemera, and he's particularly been studying the transnational circulation of French art. In this connection, he organised a panel at the Association for Art Historians in 2021, which was entitled Provincialising Impressionism, in which he proposed new frameworks for thinking about the local dimensions of this most global of art movements. Sisters Gwendoline and Margaret Davies were among the most significant early collectors of Impressionism in Britain before the First World War. And in tonight's lecture, Samuel will explain the importance of this specifically Welsh context. Wales in the early 20th century was in the grip of profound economic, social, political, and cultural change. And I'm really fascinated to hear how collecting Impressionism might fit in with that historical moment. So after the talk, there'll be a chance for questions. We can continue the conversation over a glass of wine. But for now, Samuel, thank you so much for travelling to be with us. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that very generous introduction. I didn't write it, I promise, but it's very nice. And thank you all of you for coming. It's so nice to have such a lovely turnout. It's always such a pleasure to come back to the Courtauld, especially with a few years of research in the back pocket I can present, so thank you very much. This evening, I want to take us first to South Wales on the eve of the First World War, where Impressionism and Post-Impressionism have just landed with fanfare. South Wales is at the present moment in the throes of an art upheaval. Thousands of people in Cardiff and Swansea are now talking and reading art who a year or two ago would have never dreamed it possible. This astonishing transformation was the result of a run of trailblazing exhibitions, the earliest of which was organised by Spencer Gogh at the Welsh Museum in Cardiff in June 1912. The show collected some or all of the canvases that Roger Fry had just shown at the Galerie Barbazange in Paris the month earlier, and included, amongst others, Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, Walter Sickert, and Percy Wyndham Lewis. The following February, the newly minted National Museum of Wales staged its first exhibition at Cardiff City Hall. Drawing mostly from the collections of Gwendoline and Margaret Davies, the lone exhibition of paintings valorised Edouard Manet, Claude Monet, and Auguste Rodin. The National Museum's next exhibition collected certain modern artists of Welsh birth or extraction, including Augustus John, Frank Brangwyn, E.H. Thomas, and Christopher Williams. Meanwhile, nearly 7,000 residents of Swansea flocked to the Glenvivian Art Gallery to see back-to-back exhibitions of Winford Dewhurst, billed as the first English Impressionist, and Arthur Melville, Scottish alumnus of the Greystones colony, with whom, for one excited resident, Impressionism triumphed in colour orchestration. Visitors to these exhibitions in Swansea were already well familiar with the 6 paintings by Rouen Impressionists, owned by the Glenvivian since its founding in 1911, a gift of the industrialist François Despaux, who in the summer of 1914 loaned 44 more works for an exhibition celebrating the École de Rouen. Contemporaries were giddy with the novelty and national import of these exhibitions. The post-impressionist show was, quote, the first of its kind in Wales. The 1913 Loan exhibition was not only the most important event ever organised within the Principality, but the greatest artistic event in the history of Wales. The following certain modern artists was promised to be epoch-making for Welsh art. The exhibitions at the Glynvivian in Swansea manifested, quote, the Welsh Renaissance and how Swansea was leading the way. In particular, commentators hoped that these exhibitions would educate the Welsh public to value beauty and inspire Welsh artists to, quote, speak for their race and time. Impressionism and post-impressionism then landed in South Wales at a high point of the Welsh Renaissance, a moment of rediscovered interest and pride for the distinctiveness of Welsh history, culture, language and identity. While Impressionism was already a familiar concept, now with its physical arrival, it became imbricated in Welsh concerns about national identity and the unresolved process of making sense of the vast changes wrought by industrial modernity. Often conflated, Impressionism and post-Impressionism offered a radically modern visual language through which it was hoped Welsh artists might speak to the Welsh experience of what Wales now was. Seen from within, Wales had been imagined as a country of small towns and villages, as an organic and classless folk society bound together by a shared language, Cymraeg, a shared religious ethics, non-conformity, and a shared politics, liberalism. Seen from without, Wales was pictured as an unspoiled Arcadia, a land of myths, history, and picturesque decay, a place on the whole to pass through. It was the landscape, not the inhabitants, that stirred the romantic imagination. The Celtic natives were to be enjoyed as, in Peter Law's phrase, bucolic furniture. So successfully did English artists help reduce Wales to its landscape, that as late as 1886, the Anglican Bishop of St David's, Basil Jones, could dismiss Wales as, quote, merely a geographical expression, which had never had a national unity. Infamously, the 1888 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica had just one thing to say under its listing for Wales: see England. However, the rapid industrialisation, urbanisation, and internal and external migration, localised primarily in the South Wales coalfield, had created a modern, class-based industrial society that was difficult to reconcile with either of those received ideas of what Wales was. As historian John Davies puts it, by 1895, industrial modernity embodied reality for the majority of the inhabitants of Wales. But this situation had come into being so rapidly that the image of Wales did not correspond with the substance of Wales. Contemporaries felt keenly this sense of incongruity, this sense of lacking an appropriate national image or national artistic language. In 1906, Iona Williams, for example, saw a Welsh school of painting as a necessary but as yet absent proof of the self-evident fact that, quote, the Welsh are a living nation with a definite national character. A people that is a nation should have an art, which utters its vision to the world. Thomas Edward Ellis admitted in 1899 with, quote, sorrow as well as with frankness, that not the most patriotic of us can claim for Wales the possession of a native school of art. Some too keenly felt the alienation of a changing Wales. the socialism of the working class metropolis of Merthyr Tydfil, and the materialism of the new middle class world of Cardiff, as Kenneth Morgan describes them, were inimical to the nonconformist values that had traditionally been felt to bind the Welsh folk. In the 1890s, Llewellyn Williams would lament to his fellow partisans of Cymru Faith that Swansea was, quote, a howling wilderness of Philistinism. Barry was a large, rapidly growing town intent on nothing but money-making, and Cardiff was already lost to Welsh nationalism. Christopher Williams, himself working hard to find an appropriate visual form for Welshness, had called for exhibitions of great pictures to let people know what's going on in the art world of today. And so this is why the experience of modern pictures aroused such excitement in Cardiff and Swansea. Places that looked nothing like the Wales of the mind's eye, but which were the face of modern Wales. And crucially, it was the very same forces which had built the industrial South that delivered Impressionism to it. The importation of modern art was financed by the industrial extraction of coal and staged for the ostensible benefit of the many thousands who mined, processed and transported it. Gwendoline and Margaret Davies inherited shares in the family coal company, Ocean Coal Limited, and between 1908 and 1921 spent their dividends creating the most significant collection of modern French art in the UK after Hugh Lane. Their grandfather, David Davies, had built up Barry from a tiny hamlet into the largest export dock in Wales. In 1913, Ocean Coal produced 2.4 million tonnes of coal and employed 8,000 people. Likewise, Francois Despaux, who we met loaning Rouennais works to Swansea, had in 1892 purchased an anthracite mine in nearby Abercraf and made his fortune importing Welsh coal to his native Rouen. Despaux regularly visited South Wales, and in 1897 he sponsored Alfred Sisley's painting tour of the Welsh coast. While enamoured with the rugged coastline and captivated by effects of light, in these his only surviving seascapes, Sisley also records the international traffic in coal which underwrote this final chapter of his career and which bound South Wales into global networks of modernity and empire. Now, this is a talk about collectors, but I've started with this wider context and longer history because they really matter for assessing the impact and the significance of the Davies sisters' trailblazing collection. Often, the history of collecting is told as the story of individuals whose advanced taste allowed them to stand above their context and outshine their contemporaries. Yet, the meanings, the impact, and the historical significance of a collection can far exceed the intentions of its maker. Moreover, individual taste is, of course, formed and expressed within networked regimes of knowledge and socially mediated experiences of texts, images, and objects. As a process taking place within a wider network, collecting can be understood as an act of setting in motion, of translocating, translating, and transforming. The concepts and capital, the artworks and individuals, the desires and the discourses that collecting incites into motion find their way to unexpected places and take on unexpected meanings. Their movement often follows the global circuits of trade, migration, conquest, and colonization. And while reflecting the structural inequalities at stake in global modernity, the mobility, exchange, translation, and hybridizations between cultures the results are always more multifaceted, multipolar, and multidirectional than any simplistic notion of transmission from metropoles out. In traversing national, cultural, and linguistic borders, artworks and ideas about artworks can simultaneously connect national contexts and facilitate cross-cultural exchange, while also bolstering nationalist imaginaries and essentialist notions of incommensurable difference. The commonalities between the collecting practices and the collections of Oskar Reinhart and the Davies sisters, which I want to just very briefly trace, point to their operating within such shared transnational structures and networks. The Davies sisters began to really collect in earnest in 1912, purchasing works by Whistler, Monet, Manet, Boudin, Daumier, Millet and Rodin to complement those by Turner, Corot and David Cox they've been buying since 1906. By 1914, they'd amassed a really exceptional collection. Outstanding, John Ingersoll calls it in Great Britain, for the quantity of French late 19th century works. During and after the First World War, Gwendoline in particular expanded her collection with further Impressionist masterpieces. And progressive acquisitions of works by Vincent van Gogh and Paul Cezanne. As I've highlighted, these pictures were paid for with coal money. Reinhardt, who, like the Davies sisters, acquired his first Impressionist canvas and now lost Renoir in 1912, also, like the Davies sisters, bought art with proceeds from the family firm, Volkart Brothers, which specialised in trading cotton and coffee before diversifying into shipping and insurance. Reinhardt visited the company's Indian operations in 1909. After a substantial inheritance from his father in 1919, Reinhardt's collecting accelerated and the scale of his ambitions significantly expanded. Reinhardt, as Kerstin Richter noted in the catalogue to the current exhibition, collected with a keen sense of what she calls the greater good, an awareness of how, as he himself put it, having a duty to serve others with my knowledge, my work, and my possessions. This bore fruit in the acquisition of the Villa am Romerhout in 1924 and its transformation into the eventual home of a public collection. Likewise, the Davies sisters collected art with the ambition that it might contribute to the public good. As early as February 1913, they put their collection and their fortune to work by supporting the Lone exhibition of paintings at Cardiff City Hall. They lent 38 of the 59 artworks exhibited. They defrayed the costs of its staging so they could offer free admission, and they underwrote a range of educational activities which included a series of gallery talks and a syllabus of public lectures by eminent speakers. The curators for the show wrote around all the big employers asking them to release their workforce for an afternoon so they could go. They also lent works to Swansea's Glenvivian in 1914 and to the National Eisteddfod in Barry in 1920. At this latter exhibition, Gwendoline spoke to the crowd on the place of art in life and expressed her pleasure that the public were now realising the importance of art. Inspired by Ruskinian ideas about the improving quality of beauty and the national discourse on the necessity of a Welsh artistic renaissance, Gwendoline and Margaret supported public exhibitions of their collection to, as a contemporary newspaper reviewer phrased it, illustrate different tendencies in modern French art as an example for artists and the public to follow. Reinhardt and the Davies sisters both acquired their taste for Impressionism through international travel. As Katja Baumhoff recounts, Reinhart's visits to Paris, London, Berlin, Munich and beyond from 1906 were milestones in his path to Impressionism. For the Davies sisters, it was tours of Italy in 1902, 08 and 09, with stops in Paris to visit the Louvre, the Salon, the Spring Exhibition at the Grand Palais and the galleries of Bernheim Jeune that formed their early education. Their physical and visual encounter with Impressionist artworks in these places was mediated, of course, by the curators and the dealers who staged the museum and the gallery shows that they saw, as well as the critics and historians whose books and articles they so avidly read. Reinhardt's guiding light was the brilliant Julius Meyer-Grauf, Impressionism's foremost advocate and most sensitive mediator in the German-speaking world. In 1906, Reinhardt visited the German Centenary exhibition that he co-curated alongside Hugo von Schude in Berlin, which daringly celebrated German Impressionists at a moment of fervent nationalism and anti-French sentiment. Baumhoff describes Meyer-Grauf's monograph, The History of the Development of Modern Art, as Reinhardt's aesthetic guidebook, and notes that he was a regular reader of the periodical Kunst und Künstler, published by the Berlin-based dealer Paul Cazier, which featured articles by Tudy and Meyer-Grauf. For her part, Margaret Davies attended a comprehensive art history course in Dresden in the winter of 1907-08, with lectures accompanied by museum visits. Her notes record her appreciation of Turner and of Whistler as what she called a romantic impressionist. Already in 1908, the sisters were being represented by their trusted advisor Hugh Blaker, the then curator of the Holborn of Menstrie Museum in Bath and staunch advocate of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism in the groove of Roger Fry. Blaker guided their developing taste, while in 1909 Margaret had found some of the works in the Louvre, quote, too impressionist to suit me. By 1912, Blaker was commending their desire to get some examples of the Impressionists of 1870, because very few English collectors except Hugh Lane have bought them at all. It was after visiting Paris in 1912, during Bernheim Jeune's show of Monet's Venetian scenes, that the sisters took the plunge. Later, Blaker's counsels were supplemented by those of David Kroll Thompson, the Edinburgh-born dealer and critic who sold London on the Barbizon School, and Emile Bernheim, cousin of the Bernheim Jeune gallery owners. Both sisters spoke French. They owned a copy of, I went through the library, one book only survives, I'm sure they had many more. They owned a copy of Théodore Duré's Histoire des peintres impressionnistes. And Margaret translated Ambrose Vollard's biography of Cezanne from the French in full. These overlapping networks of curators, scholars, and dealers thus inculcated these collectors into shared ways of understanding Impressionism, which are traceable in their collections. Both collections frame Impressionism as a way of seeing or a worldview, rather than an exclusive or unique innovation of a particular movement or school. And so, in both then, French Impressionism is situated within a trans-historical and transnational framework in ways that drew from leading thinkers like Meyer-Grauf, Tudy and Fry. In both collections, 19th century Impressionist works are juxtaposed with old masters. This wasn't simply a product of collectors coming to modern art slowly from more conservative taste, but rather a deliberate ploy to situate Impressionism in a longer historical trajectory. Thus, both collections feature Impressionism's immediate precursors and the forerunners of plein air landscape painting, including Camille Corot. Likewise, they feature works by artists like Honoré Daumier and Jean-François Millet, who were widely linked to Impressionism at the time for their shared capacity to simplify. For the same reason, Reinhardt collected classical works by Nicolas Poussin, Jean-Chimien Chardin, and Claude Lorrain, which, following Meyergraaf's counsels, he saw as important precursors to the modernist breakthrough. The Davies sisters, for their part, collected the classical landscapes of Welsh landscape painter Richard Wilson. Impressionism's deeper roots were illustrated in the looser handling of figures including El Greco, Peter Paul Rubens, Diego Velázquez, and Frans Hals. Reinhardt also collected Netherlandish old masters who cultivated a recognizably impressionist sensitivity to light, air, and effect. In the Davies collection, impressionistic effects were well represented primarily by a wealth of works by Turner and John Constable, but also by 17th century Netherlandish painters, including van der Eekhout, a follower of Rembrandt. While the Davies sisters' earliest acquisitions were the pre-impressionist plein-air landscapes of Turner, Constable, Corot, and David Cox, they continued to collect such works after their first impressionist acquisitions in 1912, and their old master purchases only became significant after 1920, with acquisitions by Benjamin Cuyp, Sandro Botticelli, Diego Velázquez, El Greco, Frans Hals, and Anthony van Dyck all coming in that year. So as I said then, it's not a simple ascending trajectory of taste culminating in Monet, Manet, and Renoir. And these later acquisitions were also making good on trans-historical connections that had been made as early as 1913. At a lecture accompanying the Lone Exhibition of Paintings, the sisters' primary advisor, Hugh Blaker, educated the public in the view that, quote, the Impressionist movement is modern only in name and dates back almost as far as the beginnings of art. The catalogue note described Edouard Manet as a modern Hals, painting with swiftness and certainty, and, like Hals, almost disregarding chiaroscuro. Blaker's words echo those of Reinhardt. Quote, Impressionism, painting that records only fleeting impressions, setting aside knowledge of the subject gained by other methods. Velázquez was an Impressionist, and, among more recent painters, Manet, Liebermann, and many others. Because this trans-historical vision of Impressionism had so many international reference points, this also implied that Impressionism was an international, a transnational phenomenon. Thus, alongside Monet and Manet, the Davies sisters acquired Turner and Constable, Whistler and Eugène Boudin, Anton Mauve and Narcisse Diaz, Adolphe Monticelli, Marius Morris, Léon Le Hermite and George Clausen, Frank Brangwyn and Augustus John, Jan van Mastenbroek and Antonio Mancini. Oskar Reinhart, after largely filling out his collections of French Impressionism, turned his attention to examples of Impressionism, Romanticism and Realism from Switzerland, Germany and Austria. I've taken the time to go through all these similarities in the collections because I want to illustrate the point that they share. They point to the practice of collecting as a collaborative activity within shared frameworks of knowledge. One must not be too reductive. While both collections, for example, share a disproportionate weighting towards landscapes, it's for different reasons. As Kirsten Richter remarks, Reinhardt's view of art was profoundly aesthetic, prioritizing visual qualities and direct experience of artworks. He favoured colour, movement, and painterly texture. The subject was secondary to him. While the Davies sisters also preferred to see an artwork up close before committing, their preference towards landscape had more to do with the longer history and national significance of landscape painting in Wales and their deeply held religious convictions. Scenes of rustic simplicity, moral altruism, and honest work appealed to their Calvinistic Methodist sensibilities as strongly as pictures of Parisian gaiety appalled them. Yet the predominance of these connections reveal two collections as materializations of a pan-European discourse on Impressionism, filtered through individual sensibilities and local circumstances. And it's to these local circumstances I want to now turn in the final part of the talk. And in particular, looking and going back to that moment, that South Wales artistic renaissance was a moment when a collection can start to slip beyond the grasp, beyond the control of its collector. Arriving at this moment of Welsh Renaissance, the Davies sisters' collection was ascribed a national mission. By assembling the best of modern painting, the exhibition was intended to improve public taste and inspire a Welsh artistic revival. The Davies sisters themselves certainly did support this ambition. They were important benefactors of the new museum as well as other cultural institutions, like the Department of Art and the Arts and Craft Collection at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. I mentioned that they took a mid-Victorian, very Ruskinian view of the intrinsic value of art and the importance of prevalent beauty for a nation's moral health. This manifests in a paternalism evident in their circle. Murray Urquhart, co-curator of the 1913 show, spoke of his hope that Impressionism would, quote, direct the Welsh towards a more noble standard of taste. Such comments echoed the casual English disdain for the unvisual and uncultured Welsh that was in fact both repeated and resisted by leading Welsh national thinkers. And I say casual meaning reflexive and accepted. This map from the art historian Peter Lord's private collection and currently on display at the National Library of Wales shows child Wales next to Mother England joining the British and Irish nations in waving off the troops. Now, behind this cutesy, patronising image festered a firmly racialised contempt. One popular and well-received 1910 tract, The Perfidious Welshman, written under the telling pseudonym of Dried Glass, intended to mean Blue Dragon, catalogued a list of failings, quote, inferior intellect, excitability, deceitfulness, absurd vanity, hatred of the Saxon, immorality, and shocking want of culture in the arts, which all stemmed from, quoting again, an inferior racial origin. Still quoting, the Taffy is none other than a low-bred Mongol of Mongolian origin, and belongs to the same low caste as the Basque, the Tartars, Magyars, Finns, and Turks. Still quoting, beauty and refinement are foreign to him. Wales is destitute in the realm of painting and the allied arts. Dirty cottages are decorated with cheap coloured prints. Still quoting, no people were ever less fitted to call their country their own and themselves a nation than the Welsh. The Welsh language is vulgar to use in decent society. A millstone around your neck, civilization abhors it. Now, the book was marketed by the publisher as a satire, but its invective against the racially inferior Celts was celebrated in the English press. It was, quoting one review in the Court Journal, a strong indictment of the Welsh by one who's lived several years among them and thoroughly knows their characteristics. The Manchester Courier hoped that, quote, the work will not be entirely unattended by with good Taffy to himself. There are many points wherein he may, with advantage, mend his manners. David Lloyd George, in contrast, called the book foul garbage. Even if an attempt at humour, even if an exaggeration, the book nonetheless made fun by repeating stereotypes in common currency. The Daily Mail recounted that, quote, it recapitulates, in exaggeration, all the faults which tradition gives to the Welshman. Such commentary then about the Celts as a mongrel race enacted the scientific racism and racial hierarchies then being put to work to legitimise the British Empire. The book excited such a strong furore in Wales, not only because it was the latest in a long line of English diatribes against the pillars of Welsh identity, but also because it reinforced a strongly and widely held sense of Wales as England's first colony, of a shared experience of the Welsh language being deliberately and systematically suppressed, of Wales being evacuated in reality and representation, of a distinct culture and envisioned as an empty, rugged wilderness. At the same time, however, such refrains also reflected an important strand of thinking within the Welsh nationalist revival, one which drew from Oxford scholar Matthew Arnold, who in 1867, in his study of Celtic literature, had famously evoked a romantic and ethnographic vision of Wales where the past still lives, inhabited by a Celtic race governed by emotion and sentiment. The Celtic genius for poetry, where emotion counts for so much, was balanced by a corresponding sense of difficulty with painting and sculpture, where emotion must be tempered by a sense of measure. Early 20th century notions of a rebirth, then, hinged on a notion of recovery and rediscovery of a suppressed national and racial identity. For some, like Owen Roscommon, this entailed rewriting Welsh history as the heroic story of 1100 years of struggle and hot action. At the 1909 National Pageant of Wales, 200,000 visitors watched 4,000 costumed volunteers dramatise Welsh history, starting with the resistance to Roman colonisation, through to the romance of King Arthur, the great medieval kings and princes, Henry V and Agincourt, the ascent of the Tudors, and ending with Henry VIII's Act of Union in 1536. The industrial elite took on starring roles. The Marchioness of Bute played Dame Wales, and workers from the dockyards and the coal exchanges were mobilised to fill out gaps in the volunteer base. The early 20th century was a high point of historical interest in Wales's medieval past. From historical pageants to school textbooks, academic histories to marble sculptures, Hywel Dda, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, Owain Glyndŵr, and the Tudor kings loomed large in the Welsh psyche. An alternative but often complementary vision was articulated in Carnarvon in 1904 at the Pan-Celtic Congress. Archdruid Hwfr led delegations from Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, the Isle of Man, and Cornwall in affirming their ethnic identity through pseudo-historical rituals and invented traditional dress. Artist Christopher Williams, who painted a portrait of Hwfr at the Congress, felt himself, quote, one of a mass of Celts among Celts, steeped in Celtic ideals, flooded with early Welsh history and the pre-Arthurian tales and mythology. The Mabinogion has been in constant use. Williams would write in 1907 that, quote, Wales has never been given a chance, and it's the knowledge of her past history that prevents me from utter despair. So, when Impressionism and Post-Impressionism land in South Wales just a few years later, it was being seen through eyes steeped in Celtic ideals and with hearts stirred by hot medieval action. For example, one attendee to Spencer Gore's 1912 exhibition characterised Post-Impressionism as combining an appeal to the elemental senses and emotions with individual expression, and then linked these qualities to Wales's historical situation and her innate Celtic temperament. Wales has fought, is fighting, and will continue to fight for liberty. The rebel instinct is the most potent factor in our nationalism. We want liberty of thought and freedom of expression. We welcome sincere striving after the ideal, whether in political, social, literary, or artistic spheres. There is no finality for the Celtic mind, and we have confidence in our own discrimination. Perhaps this is why Cezanne, Gogh, Van Gogh, and their rebel followers may someday hang side by side of their contemporaries in a Welsh National Art Gallery. The 1913 Loan exhibition made an even bigger impression. Hugh Blaker articulated its nationalist remit. This exhibition is the greatest artistic event in the history of Wales, promoted by collectors, i.e. the Davies sisters, whose object is to place a true ideal before the Welsh people, give stimulus to the long-delayed revival in Welsh art, and place the Welsh nation, temperamentally fitted for artistic expression, among the leading art producers in the world. Edgar Jones, who was the headmaster of Barry County School and a fixture of the Cardiff art world, expanded on this idea while praising Blaker and Company's keen insight into the Welsh temperament. The Celt's love of poetry, of music, of mysticism, of spiritual ideals is wooed by the poetry of colour and the witching glamour of a Turner, a Corot, or a Monet, by the musical rhythm of a Diaz, a Monticelli, or a Maris, by the spiritual insight of a Millet. These impressionist works all stimulate a certain emotion and appeal to Welshmen of sensitive temperament. Now, interestingly, this exhibition travelled to Bath, where it excited absolutely no commentary at all. In the exhibition catalogue, Impressionism was ascribed an ambivalent historicity which aligned to the nostalgic modernity of Celtic revival Welsh nationalism. In one respect, it was shockingly new. Monet and his followers constituted one of the most revolutionary changes in modern times. This modernity was felt to resonate especially with industrial South Wales. As early as 1884, the critic Frederick Wedmore had been glad to speak in Cardiff, one of the centres of modern industry, on the importance of modern life in pictorial art. He exhorted Welsh artists to not be afraid to place the steam plough in the quiet field, or the tall, gaunt chimney of the copper works away on the flat marshes by the river's mouth. Yet, it was also burnished with a reassuringly historical patina. Blaker stressed that the Impressionist movement was modern in name only. This chimed with the dual notion that the Welsh are the oldest race in these isles, as Christopher Williams put it, thus equating the old master provenance of Impressionism with the deep historicity of Celtic art, and also the youngest, having only just awoken from centuries of colonial slumber. The critical reaction to Impressionism and post-Impressionism then was drawing on pre-existing notions of the aesthetic sensitivities of the Celt in the context of Welsh nationalist ambitions. Both were seen to express a rebellious individualism, cultivate an emotional response through poetic colour, and reach for an ideal beyond the merely visible. As in other Celtic contexts, most notably in Scotland and Ireland, a nationalist racialised lens then allowed commentators to draw connections across already flimsy boundaries of style. Thus, the pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones could be brought into the fold thanks to his Welsh blood. For Thomas Edward Ellis, Burne-Jones' richness of detail and wealth of decorative power afford striking proof of the aesthetic sensitivities of the Celt. And so he was included for this reason in the 1913 exhibition, Certain Modern Artists of Welsh Birth or Extraction. At the opening, Welsh sculptor William Goskin John praised Burne-Jones as an example of a quality, he said, in artists of mixed parentage. So many of them had been innovators. They added colour and charm to the output of the British Isles. This racial basis for Welshness, as well as the motif of Welsh artists as contributors to a British school, closely mirrored the dominant political economy, which valorised Welsh distinctiveness within the framework of British imperialism. Thomas Edward Ellis was highly influential in articulating Britain as an equal admixture of Teutonic and Celtic elements. We are proud of an empire on which the sun never sets. And articulated the success of the British Empire for its capacity to combine Germanic materialism with Celtic spirituality. So then, the very same racial characteristics which had fit Impressionism to the Celt were at the same moment being articulated to fit the Celt to imperialism. To give just one example, in 1902, William Goodman Edward Rees described the Welsh as a neglected imperial asset. Edward Rees saw the empire as a community of free nations preserving a diversity of race and benefiting from their mixture. The child who is born of parents of different races, for example, a Scotchman and a Welshwoman, is likely to be brighter than either of his parents, with the caveat that, quote, these races are on the same plane of civilization. For Edward Rees, the Welsh are the best linguists among white men, thanks both to the sensitivity of the Celtic mind and to, quote, our position as a conquered race, resulting in centuries of enforced bilingualism. For Edward Rees, polyglot Welsh should aid the Englishman's worldwide trade and help them rule a worldwide empire. Policing the boundary between positive, i.e. white, racial diversity and the implicit danger of miscegenation, Edward Rees elevates the Welsh within prevailing racial hierarchies and uses the English colonisation of Wales to legitimise complicity in empire. This was the same worldwide trade that Sisley had captured just a few years earlier during his trip to Wales, paid for by coal magnate François Despaux. Welsh coal literally fueled the British Empire, empowering global hegemony by powering Royal Navy vessels. And the South Wales industrial elites benefited enormously from the markets opened by British power. The Davies family firm, for example, owned the Port Said and Suez Coal Company. The Dowlais Ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil had subsidiaries in Spain and the Russian Empire, importing Basque workers from Bilbao and sending Welshmen to the industrial colony in the Donbass. Here, as elsewhere, industrialism and imperialism go hand in hand. Gwynalf Williams describes an imperial South Wales with a specifically working class consciousness suitably adjusted to novel imperial contexts. New identities, no less simultaneously Welsh national and British imperial, were being forged. This imperialist culture saw the Welsh establish their own colony, Olathe in Patagonia, send missionaries to India, disperse settlers to Canada, Australia and South Africa, and celebrate their achievements as colonial administrators and rulers. The Welsh overseas not only exported and imposed Welsh language and cultural forms, but as Rhys Owens has recently articulated, ruled over colonial subjects in a self-consciously Welsh manner. Thus, the very real and long-standing processes and experiences of cultural prejudice, political subordination, linguistic suppression, social assimilation, and racial othering, which had motivated the colonisation of Patagonia in search of a Welsh homeland away from English domination, also spurred many Welsh to be, in Gwynalf Williams' term, enthusiastic junior partners in the British Empire. And so when Impressionism was imported to Wales via the capital and networks of industrialised empire, it was assimilated into the very regimes of knowledge and value by which empire was being legitimised and celebrated. Both empire and Impressionism were, at this time in Wales, being framed as vehicles for national reawakening in the wider context of what Priest Morgan calls imperial Welshness. Understood in racialised terms, Impressionism was then integrated into a nascent Welsh art canon, itself based on race rather than style. And while the Welsh art history which emerged drew its conceptual architecture from imperialist discourses, in which a Welsh racial genius was recuperated in terms of its contribution to British global domination. And so, if it's possible to speak of a Welsh Impressionism, it's not as a borrowed style or a peripheral movement of painters. Rather, it's only possible to speak of many interlinked practices of Impressionism in early 20th century Wales, including art making, but also visual reproduction, art writing, collecting, curating, and dealing. Welsh Impressionists were those who translated, mediated, and adapted the shared project of Impressionism to suit the local circumstances of a space imbricated in the global processes of modernity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel, for a completely fascinating paper, but also was a wonderful introduction to the art of Christopher Williams as well, and sort of other lesser-known Welsh artists. So it was a kind of beautiful presentation. And I also really appreciate the efforts you made to link to Oskar Reinhart. So thank you. That was very fruitful. We will have questions from the floor. I just want to abuse Chair's privilege and ask two mini questions first. The first is about resistance to French painting in Wales. And obviously you showed all of the ways in which they're trying to build a bridge between Welsh experience and modern French art. But also I wondered about chauvinism and kind of anti-Frenchness and anti-cosmopolitanism. And the reason I ask is because in these very years, Wales has one of the only pogroms in British history in terms of being a resistance to outsiders. And I just wondered whether you'd ever come across kind of Francophobia or kind of anti-modern sentiment in some of the criticism. The other thing I wanted to ask was also about artists trading on their Welshness internationally. And you mentioned Frank Brangwyn for a moment, who obviously became a huge artist across the empire, but also in Central Europe. And I just wonder how far are some of these Welsh exports as artists playing on their Welshness in those new contexts as well?
Well, two fantastic questions. Thank you so much. In the first case, I would say I became really interested in the Davies sisters' collection, which is housed in Amgueddfa Cymru in Cardiff, as something which I was sort of surprised to encounter. This fantastic French collection in a Welsh institution, just arriving, that felt very incongruous as an outsider. And that was sort of partly what motivated the research project in the first case. But actually what I found is that was I was imposing my preconceptions about what Impressionism was. I was imposing this idea that it's a French innovation and a French phenomenon, and oh, how strange to find it in new spaces. And actually, contemporaries in industrial South Wales didn't really feel that sense of incongruity about French Impressionism. And perhaps there's a few reasons for that. The essay on the Welsh as a neglected imperial asset makes it very clear that racial diversity within the empire has to be quite carefully policed and ensuring that its race is on the same plane of civilization. So I think there was a sense in which France was sort of safe in that sense. But I'm speaking here about South Wales. I quoted Llewellyn Williams from Cymru Fydd. Lots of the sort of North Wales intelligentsia and nationalist thinkers did see the sort of immigration-fueled communities of Merthyr Tydfil, of Swansea, of Cardiff as no longer Welsh, because there were so many outsiders, because chapel attendance was down, because there was more languages being spoken. And so there's this sort of moment of fracture. And I haven't been able to find any examples of exhibitions of Impressionism in North Wales or Mid Wales. They're localised very much in the south. So I think it sort of depends where in Wales you are, really. And what was your second question?
Just about whether it's kind of like Brangwyn, does he play on his Welshness, these artists of Welsh extraction? Is that something that they use in new international contexts?
That's a really good question. I don't want to speak too far beyond my expertise. I know that Augustus John was quite, maybe conflicted is a bit strong, but he wasn't always proud of his Welsh background, and there's some quite fruity quotes where he's lamenting the lack of an art world and the lack of appreciation for art in Wales. So it wasn't always something that was on the forefront of their mind. And so many modernists were deliberately internationalist and deliberately cosmopolitan, and so perhaps not investing in a national identity in the same way that the sort of intelligentsia in Cardiff would have wished them to do.
Wonderful. Questions for Samuel? Just put your hand up. Let's take it at the back. They got there first, I think. There's a microphone coming down. Sorry.
Thank you, that was great. I have a question about more of the sisters. If you could tell us a bit more about them and how they collected, did they band together, did they, what else did they do? Did they have families? Did they have any other responsibilities that stood in the way of collecting?
Yeah, really good question. So they collected together and also separately. It's hard to disentangle the two collections. They sort of began collecting together. Gwendoline was a bit more, I would say, advanced and progressive. It was Gwendoline who was buying Cezanne and Van Gogh, but she stopped collecting in 1926 because of the experience of firstly the First World War and secondly the Great Depression. She sort of felt it was morally unjustifiable to be spending their inheritance on buying nice pictures when they could be helping people. And so for them actually, and I sort of didn't go into this too much, but they kind of come to collecting as a form of philanthropy, and it's almost not, I don't think they would have felt it was the most important thing they did. I think they would have been a bit surprised that we've been so obsessed with their Impressionist pictures, and not, for example, the fact that they facilitated Belgian refugees to come over in the First World War, that they paid for a massive tuberculosis vaccination campaign, that they were so desperate to bring music to industrial and remote communities that they paid for people to push grand pianos up and down the valleys to do music nights. They bought shoes for school children in Montgomeryshire. Their country house of Grugannogh near Newtown in what's now Montgomeryshire, they wanted to make that as a home for an arts and crafts revival. So they patronised local craftsmen, sponsored their education. They paid for school children to come in to see the collection and learn how to paint. Their brother, David Davies, was very into international peace. And so at Grugannogh they hosted early meetings of the League of Nations and other international committees. So you sort of talk about these things as getting in the way of collecting. They did, but they saw their collecting as part of their sort of philanthropic mission to do something good for Wales. And both of them ended up donating their collection to the National Museum. After Gwendoline stopped, Margaret kept collecting, and after Gwendoline died in 1951, Margaret spent the last 10 or so years of her life basically collecting for the museum and allowing the curators to advise her on what they would like to fill out their collection. And so they disposed of some of the Monets, for example, in order to fund works by modern British and modern Welsh. So again, I sort of didn't go into that part of their collection because I was sort of interested in this singular moment. It's a really good question because the Davies sisters are so fascinating and so individual. They didn't have a family. They were strict Sabbatarians and teetotal. Actually, that doesn't sound like much fun, I have to say. But thank you very much.
Wonderful. Is there another hand up?
Was the brother David also a collector? And also, could you say a little bit about Hugh Blaker?
So was their brother David a collector? I don't know, actually. I have to say, I don't know. And Hugh Blaker, so my former head of department, Robert Merrick, is the expert on Hugh Blaker and has written a fantastic essay on him in the Journal for the History of Collections. Blaker was their, I think it was their nanny's brother, so you see, he was sort of effectively a family friend, but was a really staunch advocate of modern tendencies in art. He was a kind of admirer and avid reader of Roger Fry. He battled the Tates to place the Davies sisters' Cezannes in the Tate collection, and they were kind of quite pig-headed about that, and they eventually kind of broke them down and won away. He fancied himself a bit of an artist, so lots of his own artworks are in the collection at Grugannogh in Aberystwyth. He was also an independent dealer. A lot of the old masters that I've captioned as manner of and school of were bought from Blaker. So men from that. He was an interesting character, certainly. And there's some debate about how much the Davies sisters' collection reflects their own taste and how much they were led by Blaker. Partly, often there's a bit of a sort of sexist tendency to try and diminish the agency of women collectors and talk about their advisors in a way that we wouldn't talk about men. I sort of tried to articulate the idea that you never collect alone, whether you're a man or a woman. And it's just there's been a sort of disproportionate emphasis on advisors when it comes to women collectors. But Blaker was hugely important, just as Margaret was important for Reinhardt.
Sorry, what was the original question? I couldn't hear without the microphone.
The question was, their older brother David Davies, did he collect? And I didn't know. And then, could you speak a bit more about Hugh Blaker, their advisor? Thanks.
Yeah, so mine's a backup question on that. In terms of how many years did he advise them? And because, there's this kind of pre-First World War, and then after the First World War, and then when Margaret was collecting, when Gwendoline died. Can you just say a little bit about time frames that he was, if you know?
Yeah, so the question was, when was Blaker advising the sisters? Very intensively from about 1912 until shortly after the war, about 1918, 1920. Then when Gwendoline starts to drop off, they get other advisors. So that's when David Craw Thompson comes in, that's when Emil Bernheim comes in. They start to sort of diversify their sources of advice a bit. But that's kind of the intensive period, is that kind of period before the war.
And who advised Margaret in the 10 years where she was collecting on her own, or did she? She was confident.
Good question. I can picture his face, but I can't quite recall his name. He's the director of the museum at the time.
Okay, no worries.
A really good essay on this is Mark Evans' essay on the David sisters of Llandinum from about 2005. He talks about that.
Thank you.
On that.
So I was really interested to hear about the kind of altruistic benefactor approach to collecting art. Are there records of the 1913 exhibition and the request of employers to free up their workers to attend? Was it well attended? Are there records about that? And was there and did employers do what the David sisters hoped?
I hope they would. Yeah, that's a really good question. There aren't, as far as I've been able to find, any records in the museum, but it was really widely reported in the press. And one indication that it was very well attended was the fact that they had to put on extra gallery tours. So Blake and Urquhart would position themselves every Tuesday in the galleries, and in my imagination they're just sort of collaring people who've just gotten out of work and say, what do you think about Cezanne? But they were so well received that they had to put on extra visits. And yeah, they were kind of paying. They originally scheduled George Moore to come in, but he eventually got sick. But yeah, it was really well received, and there wasn't sort of a big appetite for it.
Samuel, thank you very much indeed. That was really fascinating, particularly the whole question of Welsh identity and research using art in order to foster or develop the idea of national identity. Just in answer to the Brangwyn question, from my knowledge of research, Brangwyn never seems to play the Welsh card. He's seen very much as a British figure and an international figure, and exhibited, as we know, very extensively around Europe, secessions and places like that. So I think that probably
Interesting.
he didn't need the Welsh tag to establish his reputation in Europe, and yet he was using his European base effectively as his primary source of exhibition and revenue. The other thing you mentioned in passing, when you were answering the question about the other interests and concerns of the Davies sisters, this question of Belgian refugees, they put a roof over the head of both Emil Klaus and of Minna, the sculptor. Did they collect either of their work, or did that encourage them to start thinking about Belgian Impressionism, or Luminism as it was called?
Yeah. That's a really excellent question. I think yes and no is the answer. So they did have some works by them, and Valerius de Sedler, who was also stationed in West Wales as well. We have a fantastic Japanese landscape of the Oswald Valley of his in our collection at the School of Art. My sense is they were sort of received as gifts rather than something that they actively collected, because they never made any other acquisitions. And actually, the three Belgian artists that they sort of placed in villages around West Wales had a miserable time. They hated it because they were, they'd been displaced. They were cut off from the rest of the refugee community, which was sort of based in London. From their letters, they were miserable, moaning about the rain. They didn't have any friends. They hated it. So I think there wasn't the basis for a long-lasting relationship, I think, on the basis of that. And when they could leave, they did, pretty much. Yeah.
Is there a final question? Oh, that's the right hand. Yes, please.
Thank you. What interests me is you have these children of successful industrialists, and there are many children of successful industrialists. But the Davies sisters, Mr. Reinhart and Mr. Courtauld, all chose to immerse themselves in the collection of art. And I don't think it's a bit like it is now, where they're looking at investment. Surely their impetus was love of what they saw, before they're thinking that it's going to be good for people or it'll improve people. Surely the impetus is simply love of what they see. And that's not difficult when you consider Impressionist painting, which is based as a way of painting the familiar, your friends, in good times, bad times, the home, the garden, the place where you live, the people around you, which I personally think that Impressionism is very popular because it actually expresses this sense of love for things around. So I'm really interested in the impetus that made the sisters and the two gentlemen such great collectors.
Absolutely. Jim Rubin recently wrote a fantastic book on why Monet matters, and he makes a similar humanist case for the capacity of art to speak to us and to sort of materialize something about the human condition, right? And I agree that neither Oskar Reinhart or the Davies sisters were collecting by numbers or collecting sort of as robots for the sake of it. I think, yeah, both of them came to it because it interested them and because it moved them. But certainly with the case of the Davies sisters, they're collecting dribs and drabs from 1906. They buy their first big Impressionist works in 1912, and in February 1913, they're paying for this massive exhibition. So I think they saw the collection as a serious enterprise was sort of part and parcel of this idea that it could be a philanthropic good for others. So I wouldn't disentangle them, if you like, and I don't think either invalidates the other. Yeah, but thank you for your question.
There were a couple of questions here. There's a flood of questions now. The lady on the right was there first. Yeah.
I'm curious about Welsh identity and Welsh construction. And just from your talk, you seem to be talking about Celtic identification and Welshness. Do you see them as identical, or do you think, or could you perhaps comment a little bit more about the distinctions that people make?
Fantastic question. So the question was about...
Excuse me, we couldn't hear the question.
You couldn't hear the question?
I think
I'm just about... Thank you, yeah, I'm just about to repeat it. Hopefully I do a good job. So the question was about the relationships between Welshness and Celticness and whether they are synonymous with each other or not, and how that relationship works. Well, I'm going to start answering this question by outing myself as English. I was born in Lancashire. In the context of early 20th century Wales, they were not synonymous. So the national pageant, Owen Roscommon, for him, he very much bristled at this idea of reducing Welsh to these sort of Celtic gnomes who live in caves. And he also sort of bristled at the idea of a sort of melancholic national story of being conquered and colonised. And that's partly why he wanted to valorise Welsh military victories, Welsh resistance, or hot action. So very much there was a debate at the time about what frame of Welshness would be most useful for the national mission. And there were also fractures within Wales, I mentioned when I was sort of answering Tom's question, so between North and South, between English speakers and Welsh speakers, between a class-based vision of society and a sort of ethnic or national-based vision of society. And absolutely these things were in conflict and debate over the whole 20th century. It seemed to be that the racial prism attached most securely to Impressionism. And that's sort of what kind of motivated the paper. It was, well, why was Impressionism racialized so strongly in these ways? And partly it was, I think, this sense that, exactly as we've been talking about, Impressionism was seen to be sort of spontaneous and emotional and aesthetic in a way that didn't require huge amounts of erudition, that wasn't doing lots of brain work, that wasn't literary. It was the closest you could get to a musical art form. And so people, I think, latched onto that idea about, oh, we're a musical people, but we don't have a school of painting. And that's, Scotland was always the example. They always looked to Scotland and said, well, why can't we be like Scots, you know? So certainly not synonymous, and certainly was a matter of contention and debate. And so I sort of tried to articulate this idea that these forms of Welshness were under construction, and discourses on Impressionism were sort of part of the site and the language through which those debates were happening. Thank you.
Just two final questions. So, lady on the left.
Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I just wondered, from a rivalry point of view, the dynasties that were in Cardiff at the time, what was the Duke's family response to the Davies sisters?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I should know, and I will find out. My sense is, because I'm thinking of like Cardiff Castle and the patronage of the Bute family was much sort of more firmly historicist and revivalist, I think. And I don't think they were as interested in the Davies sisters as collecting modern art. And that could be a really interesting area of comparison, and speaks to, again, those fractures and those debates, right? Do you dredge a Welsh art out of the kind of Celtic mists from the past, or do you take a clean break and start again with modernity? And you might say that it was the Butes and the Davies collection were sort of two sides of that coin. And it would be interesting to know how much traffic's happening between those two, or whether they're sort of operating in different sort of planes of Welshness, planes of Welsh art.
Also different media, because the Butes seem to be more interested in decorative arts.
Yeah.
And you quoted Justin John, his father worked for the Butes. He was head carpenter.
Yeah.
So they were producing fantastic decorative art pieces rather than collecting. They did collect.
Yeah. And there were other collectors of Impressionism. The Phillips family at Picton Castle had a set of Impressionist pictures, including that Renoir that was on the telly recently, that I was watching on Box of Broadcasters and doing a bit of prep. But yeah, absolutely. It wasn't only the Davies sisters, and so that wider context of collecting in Wales. Also, Winterthur Wales, Tennant, for example, was hugely important for mentoring and supporting modern Welsh painters in a way that the Davies sisters didn't really do. They had a couple of brand wins, they brought a job lot of Augustus Johns from a show in London, but it wasn't really something that they were systematically doing. And so that's again quite different. So, you know, a monographic focus can never really do justice to that richness, but you're really right to bring it up. So, thank you.
Wonderful. And our last question here.
Hi. Margaret herself enjoyed painting,
Yes.
and they're quite impressionistic. And I was just wondering if you think that was sort of derivative, or actually it was an expression of her own interest in her art as well. And further to that, of the 250 odd paintings and sculptures is in their bequest. Is there anything in the breadth of that bequest that you actually really would point to as really showing their passion for their own sort of interest in art, beyond sort of some of the headline painters that we've looked at today?
Two really good questions. Yes, Margaret was a really passionate painter. Quite a few of her works are digitised on Art UK if anybody's interested to have a look. If you visit Gwganog on the drive-in, you go past the lily pond that she had made in the grounds, which she could paint, and there's sort of this kind of chalet where she could hide from the rain and do her sort of Monet-inspired pictures. I think, yes, certainly her sensibility as an artist was at stake in her aesthetic decisions, absolutely. In terms of where they come through in the collection, I think one aspect of their collection which contemporaries really did not discuss, I think because it was sort of difficult to reconcile with what they wanted the Davies Sisters collection to do, was their religious faith. So when I'm thinking of the Coip, the Helping the Blind Beggar, the Millet peasant family, there was a sense in which they took spiritual solace in the artworks that they were collecting, in terms of the subject matter, but also I think in terms of the beauty of the works and the sentiments that they stirred. You know, they didn't collect any scenes of modern Paris, for example. And I think that reflected what they wanted from Impressionism, which was quite particular. But Blaker and Urquhart and Wedmore and all the people going to these exhibitions were a bit less interested in that, I think. And, you know, we think of modernity as a secular project, as a rationalising project, but actually it was, you know, in Wales, but also across Europe, an age of religious revival, massive religious revival. And so maybe there's something to be said for the modernity of their faith. But I think at the time, it was felt to be a different kind of Welshness. Nonconformity was the, you know, core of 19th century discourses on Welsh identity, in a way that, because these industrial metropolises were so polyglot and so diverse, and were collecting people from lots of different contexts, there was a little bit of sense of wanting to cultivate a new Welshness which could map onto that. And so, again, this is the idea of the collection and the collector sometimes going out of sync and kind of sometimes coming back together. The collection is almost sort of its own agent, which is kind of responding to these kind of like wider demands on it. But you can certainly see their individual interests and tastes coming through the collection. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's all we have time for. We're going to leave the idea of the collection as its own agent, hanging in the air. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your excellent questions. Thank you, Katie Gazzardo, who's not here, who helped organise this, and thank you to Research Forum for making everything run so smoothly. And above all, thank you, Samuel, for what I think has been a brilliantly insightful talk.